So for our last little bit of content for this unit, we're going to be looking at Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, our final two presidents of really like the 70s. So our essential question for today is, how are Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter's presidencies affected by the previous actions of the Nixon administration? Because the reality we need to accept is Nixon really had a big impact on America. And we're going to see a lot of stuff also happening economically in the 70s that play a really big role. But really keep in mind that a lot of our current distrust in the government is really going to stem from things around Vietnam and Watergate, like that 1-2 punch. So here's a little bit of the context of America in the 70s. We are overextended, which is in little quotes there. I think that's a really good description of this. We are upset at the government because of, as I mentioned, Vietnam and Watergate, which, fair. Credibility gap, and then literally a credibility gap of Nixon trying to cover up stuff while in office, and how could you? And I do want to mention the Watergate hearings are going to end up being very public. Sam Ervin from North Carolina is going to be a Democrat who leads this. And it is something that people tune in and watch. And I'm a sucker for this sort of thing. I tuned in and watched all the impeachment stuff with Trump because I'm like, oh, this is interesting. But a lot of people watched the Watergate hearings. And then we see the economy, like I mentioned. We've entered into a recession with high unemployment, bad, and high inflation, also bad. Unemployment is a problem because if people aren't employed, then they don't have money to buy stuff. And if they don't have money to buy stuff, not as many things get bought. And then companies need to save money, so they fire people. And then people are unemployed. And if they don't have money, then they don't buy stuff. Right? That's that downward spiral we talked about. But you're throwing inflation onto this where everyone's money is now becoming worth less. Not worthless, but worth less. And that means people are probably not going to be rushing out to buy things because, oh my gosh, look how expensive that's going to be. We also are seeing a decline in America's status in the world. That's concerning to Americans because we want to be the best, right? Remember, we're in the Cold War still. We're still vying for superiority over the Soviet Union, and now our status is declining. And Ford and Carter are not going to be successful in soothing a nation. This says inspiring hope, I think would be one way to look at that as well. And we'll start by looking at Gerald Ford because he's next. Gerald Ford is not elected. And I know you're like, yeah, Nixon resigned. The vice president becomes, so there you go. Of course he wasn't elected. No, like literally Gerald Ford wasn't on the ticket when Nixon was voted for. Gerald Ford was appointed and then Gerald Ford became the president. So there's this running thing across all of Ford of you're not the real president. And I'm going to pepper in here a few things about, he also fell a lot. That was the thing people were upset about, which, we haven't thought about that recently, have we? But anyway, I'm going to show you a few clips of SNL with a very young Chevy Chase who is going to be portraying Gerald Ford and really leaning into that, like, he falls a lot and also he's kind of dumb. But I do want to stress, people didn't think he was the real president. Like, and it's not necessarily like, oh, I think the process is wrong. It's more like, come on, you don't have any real moral authority or standing in this. Think back, if we want to do continuity and change, we want to compare across time periods, go back to the corrupt bargain. When Andrew Jackson is like, whoa, 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 there was a conspiracy here. That really hampers John Quincy Adams' presidency because the American people are like, I don't know. I don't think this is legitimate. Look at now. That's one of the concerns about questioning the legitimacy of the election in 2020 because people then will go, I don't think there's authority in office, and that's a problem. One of the first things Ford does is he pardons Nixon. He's like, you know what? This is better for the country. We're just going to move on. And there's a debate there, right? I mean, there's a debate about whether that was the right call to just put it behind us or not. He does it, and Americans hate it. They get very upset because this feels like a cover-up. And we saw similar things happening coming out of when, like, with the last little, like, lame duck period for Trump, when he was looking at pardoning people, and there were questions of, is he going to pardon himself, or is he going to step down and then have Mike Pence pardon him? And obviously those things didn't happen, but there is some precedent for that because that's what Gerald Ford does. And Americans feel like they don't get the justice that they deserve. And so there's animosity toward Ford. There's also going to be a term, and it's going to deal with the economy, and it's called stagflation, which sounds weird, but it basically is a stagnant economy, so the economy's not growing, and high inflation. That's bad, and that's going to dominate the 70s. So if you ever get questions around this, that's one of the main things to focus on, that stagflation in the economy in the 70s. In general, one of the easiest benchmarks for how a president does or their long-term success and legacy is what is the economy like when they're president. That's something that every president tries very hard to focus on because that's what people really care about the most. Am I employed? Am I doing well financially? What's happening to my 401k, my retirement, all of those things. And there's also going to be an oil crisis in 1973. Those are really the two big things hitting the economy. The stagflation, or specifically the inflation, right? Because the economy is just kind of stagnating, but also an oil crisis. We see some attempts at moving forward with a détente and trying to calm tensions. You can see the Helsinki Conference or the Helsinki Accords. These are known as being divided into 4 baskets. And you have a basket that's political and military focused, economic, trade, and scientific cooperation, future meetings, and then human rights. We're going to see a continuation, especially on the human rights focus, when we get to Carter. But we're seeing attempts by the Soviets and the Americans to try to sit down and solve their problems, or at least get things a little bit better, because both are facing some pressure from domestic forces over, all right, maybe let's stop with this because we're kind of over it, so let's just calm down. And another thing that's unique about Ford is people try to kill him a couple times.
However, politically inspired violence in America in that autumn was far from over. 6 years after the murderous rampage of the Manson family, one of its members was still out to get the system, personified by President Gerald Ford. September 5th, Sacramento, California.
All of a sudden, a young woman dressed in a red flowing gown jumped at the president, lunged at him, and we're told she had a gun in her hand, a Secret Service.
The White House press office has now identified the woman as Lynn Ellis Fromm, 26 years old, of Sacramento, and they say that she is linked with the Charles Manson family.
Secret Service agent Larry Boondorf was the man who stopped her.
I noticed a hand coming up very low and had something in it.
The gun was about 2 feet from the president.
I saw a hand coming up behind several others in the front row, and obviously there was a gun in that hand.
We interrupt this program to bring you the following special report from ABC News.
This is the latest on the apparent attempt to fire a gun at President Ford.
He was right. It was the latest, but not the last. 3 weeks later, a rerun. On September 22nd, in another California town, San Francisco, another radical, another gun, the same president. Sarah Jane Moore's motives were confused. Her purpose was not.
I knew that that's the only shot I would have was a headshot. He came out, looked right at me, and after I fired the shot, he stopped. Cold, and I did have time for a second shot, had never planned for a second shot, had practiced and was psyched for one shot.
One shot might have done it if it hadn't been for a man who almost wasn't there. Vietnam veteran Oliver Semple just happened to be downtown.
I said, well, the guy's from Michigan. I've never seen him in person. I'll stick around to see him, if I can see what he looks like. Everybody started pushing everybody. For some strange reason, I looked down, and I had seen Sarah Jane Moore go in her purse and pull a revolver. I yelled, "The bitch has got a gun," before I made the lunge for it, as the trigger was going off. I grabbed her, and about 10 agents and 20 policemen were on us all, just like that.
That's the one regret I have, that it was not successful.
"40 years ago today, Sarah Jane Moore aimed a gun at President Gerald Ford in San Francisco and fired a single bullet. Sarah Jane Moore received a life sentence for the attempted assassination, but she was released on parole in 2007, and Sarah Jane Moore is now speaking out and joins us this morning. What drove you to want to try to assassinate President Ford?
Well, everybody asks that, and the thing is that everybody was talking about it. They say, where did you get the idea? I don't know about the rest of the country, but in San Francisco, people were saying this all the time. Number one, we elect our presidents, we don't appoint them. And Gerald Ford was appointed, and he was appointed by a crook, if you will pardon the expression.
You missed, obviously, and how long after you fired that bullet did the sort of realization, the enormity of what you tried to do dawn on you?
The thing that surprised me, and this probably sounds very silly, is I was concerned about the publicity, but only in the Bay Area. It never occurred to me that this was a story that was going to go all over the world.
Oh my gosh.
One of the things that people are upset with Ford about is that lack of legitimacy. And there's all sorts of different reasons that people do assassination attempts, but there is this sort of negative feeling towards Ford because he shouldn't really be there and he's not the real president. In the election of 1976, you're going to see Ford running for a re-election, kind of, right? Because he wasn't elected first, or whatever. He's running against Jimmy Carter. A lot of character stuff around Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter is that small peanut farmer, and he's still alive, does a lot of building for Habitat for Humanity, and he's just kind of like not a, Washington politician. We're, as Americans, distrustful of the government, and here's this solid guy who speaks softly, and look at him, he's got his peanut farm, and you know what? He's an outsider. Let's give him a shot. And you can see in the results there, it's decently close. If you look at the electoral vote, it's 55.2% to 44.6%. If you look at the popular vote, it's a little bit closer, even of 50 and 48. So we're not massively divided. And I think this is something to keep in mind because when we start Unit 9, we're looking at Reagan, and Reagan's going to win in some pretty significant landslides. Let's look at the dividing of this map. So blue in this case is Carter and red is Ford. You can see the domination of the West Coast by the Republican, and then you're going to see the South up into the North and the Midwest-ish kind of in some places being held by the Democrats. And that's one of the values the Democrats have in Jimmy Carter because he's from the South. He's from Georgia. So you see there, like both of these guys are going to be one terms, right? Ford, not literally one term, but Carter one term. And that shows America's not really that confident in either of their performance. But Jimmy Carter can run as an outsider on this, and that's really important, especially after Watergate. And this is one of the key things to look for when we see future political events happening. Are there people who have been able to avoid having to play a part in really controversial issues? Vietnam, not playing a part in that. Watergate, not playing a part in that. The recession, not playing a part in that. And so he's able to kind of slide around that. And so that's something to look for as you get older and keep watching more and more presidential elections and whatnot. Are there ways that politicians who are maybe eyeing the presidency work to avoid having to be caught in very controversial things where no matter what stance they take, they're taking a stance and it can be controversial? Or are they trying to avoid that? So Carter has to deal with the energy crisis, stagflation, and the recession, which are pretty significant hurdles to have to jump over. The short end of this is none of the things that he tries is going to work, and America isn't really better off, and so America's ultimately going to throw in their cards with Ronald Reagan in 1980, and Carter will not win. Inflation hits 14%. Interest rates near 20%. And just to be clear on that, 20% is an astronomically high interest rate. An example for what you might want to do with interest rates if you're in a recession, let's look at COVID. So going into the COVID situation, people need, you need investments to keep businesses going and whatnot. And so what the Fed did is they essentially lowered interest rates to basically zero, which means there's essentially no cost in borrowing money, which means businesses and people were more willing to borrow money because they go, oh, well, there's no real cost associated with this. And you can kind of put that money into the economy and try and use that to keep things going. But if you have an economy stagnating and then interest rate is 20%, that's really bad. And there will be a new oil embargo that happens in 79 that will increase gas prices. And you can see in the little picture here, I'm willing to bet money. If you asked, and this would probably be your grandparents, your parents probably too young, if you asked for one of the defining characteristics of the 70s, they're probably going to go with those gas lines. I've done some stuff with bringing in my grandmother to AP classes to talk about different things, and that has come up. The thing is like, oh yeah, well, we had to wait in line for gas. And gas prices are really this thing where we like blame the president for them, and we're like, lower the gas prices or whatever. It's like the president doesn't control that. That's not really how that works. But that is something that is literally crucial in how Americans get around America. And there is huge costs associated with this because you're going to see an embargo in place. And you're going to see things like, oh, if you have an odd number on your license plate, you can only go to the gas stations these days, and an even number go these other days. You would have to wait in these really long lines just to get gas, and then you get into the whole idea of, well, you have half a tank, why are you filling up now? I have nothing, and all of this kind of competition with each other. And I want that to set the stage for, we get very upset at America in the early 2000s for focusing on oil when it comes to foreign policy and saying that getting control of oil for a consistent economic experience across America is worth fighting wars for. There's like that running meme of, there's oil and then what George Bush or America runs in or whatever, right? We're like, oh, that's terrible. This is happening in the 70s, and this is where a lot of those politicians are really cutting their teeth and seeing this is a huge crisis, and not just for America, but for their own political futures. And so it's kind of understandable why they would want to push to solidify oil futures. When it comes to foreign policy, we're going to see more of a humanitarian-focused Jimmy Carter. There is going to be a focus on human rights as a basis of U.S. foreign policy. This is something that we really can win with the Soviets over. And remember, one of the competitions we have with them, especially in poorer countries, is the notion of socialism sounds really good to people who have nothing because someone's going to come in and give them something. And democratic societies generally don't work that nicely for poor people. And so it's not a great competition. Now we can look and leverage the human rights component of this. So Carter will stop supporting foreign governments who are violating human rights. We're also going to see Jimmy Carter agree to give back the Panama Canal, which you can go back to Unit 6 for all of those like, yeah, we probably shouldn't have done it that way. However, he says we're going to give it by 1999, so he kind of kicks the can a little bit on that. One thing that I also want to emphasize, because this last part on here is one of the bigger successes of Carter's presidency, but keep in mind the idea of hawks versus doves. You are going to see Reagan come up in the 80s, and it's going to be very heavily on kind of what we would call more classical, like pound your chest American value and worth and whatnot, and big strong man stuff. And Carter is saying, hey, we should care about human rights, which is not something a lot of hawk type people are very supportive of. And he's going to do something like give back America's kind of crown jewel here in the Panama Canal and acknowledge that, yeah, maybe we approached this the wrong way. And that does not play well with hawks. And that's something that can be leveraged by future candidates. There is an attempt for peace in the Middle East, which we'll see over and over again. And this is going to be the Camp David Accords. This is one of the more significant foreign policy accomplishments for Carter. Obviously, it's not going to lead to long-term success, as you can clearly see in the Middle East now. But that is something that presidents will try and go to as like, this is the pinnacle of foreign policy accomplishments. It's why Trump spent a significant amount of time trying to focus on that as well, because that would be a significant jewel in your crown for your legacy of a presidency. But one of the biggest foreign policy blunders, I guess you could call it, for Carter is going to be the Iran hostage situation. And this is well worth a deep dive. There's a movie about this, Argo, that won Best Picture a few years ago. It's just a complicated situation, definitely worth more investigation. But anyway, what happens is in the Middle East, right, in Iran, there is a situation with the Islamic cleric, Ayatollah Khomeini. So to be a little bit more complicated about this, there was the Shah in Iran who was U.S. backed, but not really that supported by, fundamentalist Iranians, who are then going to try and lead an attack against him. That is the Iranian Revolution that will occur. the Shah is being treated for cancer in America when this happens, and we're supporting a dictator who probably the people didn't like, which, chalk that up. That's a classic American move. We'll see more of that in the future to come. But basically, Iran has a revolution within itself, and we're supporting the side that they're revolting against. So there is an animosity towards Americans. One of the key parts of this is an attack on the embassy that the U.S. has in Iran, and there are going to be 52 hostages captured. Now, the movie Argo is about the people in the embassy who were able to get out, and I think they were saying with like a Canadian ambassador and being hidden. And Argo is about the actual attempt to try and pretend to be filming a movie there and then sneak these people out by plane. So again, worth it. But there are 52 hostages, and this becomes a huge crisis for Americans. There is a ticker on TV shows or stations as they are doing the news. One day the hostages have been in there, 2 days, 3 days, and it just keeps going up and up and up and up. There are a lot of different attempts by the Americans and Carter, obviously, to try and deal with this. They try negotiation, economic threats. They even try a rescue mission that gets a problem because as they're flying there, they get hit by like a sandstorm and the helicopter fails and they got to turn around. It's a pretty significant blunder. None of these things work. Ultimately, the hostages are held for 444 days. Think about if you're running against Jimmy Carter, what are some things you can do to show that, to be in opposition, right? You can hit him on the economy. You can hit him on this foreign policy being very dovish and then be like, look, literally there's a hostage crisis and no one takes Americans' threat seriously because you've been so weak and all these other things. So we need someone to come in and stop that. There's also going to be, when Reagan is elected, you have right before, literally right of his inauguration, the hostages are going to be put on planes and sent back to America, and Reagan gets to claim the victory for that. There is a lot that you can do from an opposition standpoint. That is going to be a problem. Another thing that's going to happen here in the 70s is ultimately the end of Detente. The Soviets are going to invade Afghanistan to help prevent an anti-communist uprising. And this is kind of the end of Detente because we will then send aid to Afghan rebels. One of the things we do is, so we send like rocket launchers and stuff, grenade launchers and whatnot, to these Afghan rebels to kind of push back against the Soviets. And then when we invade Afghanistan in the early 2000s, they use those same weapons against us. So obviously we're not done with Afghanistan and its future, but not only are you seeing the end of Detente, you're seeing all these other foreign policy blunders that Carter has and this ineffectiveness of dealing with the economy. And so it is really no wonder that Reagan is going to stomp the 1980 election. If you're looking at that result, it's 90% of the electoral vote. Yeah, not particularly close. Yeah. And we'll get into Reagan into Unit 9, who really is going to be, I would argue, the founding president for the context we're living in the moment. But it's coming out of this rocky 70s. And you know what? I'll save it. I'll save it till Unit 9. So we've looked at in Unit 8 is really that march from Eisenhower in the 50s up through the end of the 70s. When we're looking at this, I really think you should focus at what are the changes, the big significant things that change throughout that. We're starting with America in a very dominant position in the world that gets threatened several times throughout, these 20-ish years. And then ultimately we start to see a downfall a little bit towards the 70s. We're seeing pushes and attempts for equality, civil rights. We talked about all the power movements as well that will happen during this time period, a real progressiving of America. And then we also see backlash against that and maybe a return to more fundamentalism. And ultimately, we will see that in the 80s, this shift back. There was the counterculture, big changes, now a shift back to more conservatism and more fundamentalism. And of course, the Cold War is still happening.